more than one question.
Yeah, we're gonna save Josh for last, and we're gonna tell him we're uncomfortable. Just tell us, and we move on. That kind of stuff. For those of you joining, you're muted, but you will be unmuted if you have questions or want to engage with Inspiring Philosophy. Just ping either Detroyer or me, or whoever, or DM me or Detroyer with your questions, or whichever you want. If you want us to read it out, that's fine.
Oh yeah, she's not recording.
Yeah, he should be here any minute. Let's come on. We need a lot of people. Okay, good. So, are you joining? Who's doing that? Okay, good. We're getting the thing started. Good. So I might. It depends on how it goes. Okay, we got another guy who joined. Yeah, good. Ozzy's all unmute you now if you want. Yeah, what's up?
Okay, thanks. Are you able to hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you now.
I think one thing that may be a good idea is if you make an announcement for the event, and in that announcement, you just let people know that anyone coming in will be muted, and if they have a question, that they should, ping you or DM you.
I'll ping it here when Inspiring Philosophy gets here. I'll ping it when he gets here.
Just so everyone has the directions or knows the rules.
Yeah. Don't worry. We'll ping. Yeah, you guys are muted temporarily. You gotta get him in here. Let's see if he should be here in 5 minutes or so. She made an announcement on this official Twitter. And let's see where we go from this. Let's see.
Of that scripture. So how can a God that defines himself as love?
Okay. Good. We're gonna have all right. So who do we have? Yeah, Detroit. Keep an eye on the general thing when he joins. By the way, keep your mics muted. Those who I didn't mute, don't noise troll or anything. Inspiring Philosophy, AMA Gogo. He's a Christian YouTuber, quite well known. All right, so yeah, we're about to get started, everybody. Thanks for your patience, and we should have him in a few minutes. I don't know what's taking so long. Let me see. Yeah, he's still getting ready. Let's wait for a bit and see if he shows. Let me see if Tom. Okay, let's see. Analyst, are you there? Yeah, we're going to be doing. Does Jack have any questions, by the way? I don't know. Yeah, there we are. Christian Idealism. You're muted as well. You're going to be unmuted if you have any questions or whatever. And there we are. We have Inspiring Philosophy. He officially joined, I think, right now. He will. Okay, so is he here? Yeah, okay. So yeah, he's here. He just arrived into the stream. Let me give him the celebrity role. Okay, so do we have Inspiring? Oh yeah. Okay, he just joined in. He came in. Should be a few minutes now. Okay. So everyone's muted. Okay. We're gonna ping as soon as he gets here. Let's not take too much time. Let's do something like 40 minutes, okay? And wrap it up. What did you notice, Canadian? Sorry, Richie. What did you notice? Oh, that he arrived? Okay. Yeah, good, yeah. I don't want people, like, going crazy. It should be good. We're waiting for him. It's kind of taking too much time. Get in here. Yeah, I don't want people like going crazy. Okay, so what's the holdup? Yes, Sasha, we're gonna give you doorman. Don't fuck it up, okay? If you have a question, that's fine. Yeah, Detroit, we want to start with questions that are like with no like rebuttal and stuff, right? We want to first keep it like an interview. Question, give him time to answer. Question, give him time to answer, and only towards the end, we have couple. Hey, yeah, Marcus, I'm gonna get rid of you if you are gonna continue with your not. Oh, he's not even here. So Boris, don't. This is actually I'm gonna unmute you. I know you're not gonna start to troll.
It might help if people put questions in the chat to begin with, so that we have stuff to.
Yeah. I'm gonna send you a couple of questions that I received. I have like at least 5.
All right.
You can start asking them. Okay. He's telling me something weird is happening. Okay, these are the 5 questions that I received. I don't remember from who, but just tell them it's one of our viewers. I'm gonna message them to you. Okay. Yeah, these are the.
Yeah, sure.
I kind of shortened them. I don't want like people went and just shortened. Yeah. Do we have inspiring in here? He's telling me something weird is happening. Did he get in here? Yeah. Hi, Darwin. Okay, something's going on here. For some reason, he's not joining. Okay, so so he joined. Okay, so he joined through a bad. Okay, so. Okay, good. Yes, Godless, I did. Several times, actually. So, where is he? All right, there he is. We're going to give us a roll. And yeah, we're ready to begin. Michael.
Hello?
Yes, Michael, can you hear us?
Yeah, sorry. I'm not familiar
right,
with Discord that well, so sometimes I get confused when I try to get on it.
So, was the last inspiring philosophy your account too? Or the. Hello?
I'm sorry, what?
Was the last inspiring philosophy account yours as well?
Last inspiring philosophy.
Okay, so then it was somebody. No worries, forget about it. So
There was another one? I don't know.
Yeah,
No.
probably an impersonator. It's fine. So no worries.
Okay.
You're the one. Okay. So are we all set? Do you want to check your microphone before we start the streaming?
Yeah, let me make sure it's set on the right thing.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's set. I'm on the Yeti
right.
mic, so it should be good.
That's fine. It should be fine. So you know the format. We're gonna start off with very like simple questions, and you're fine with like 35, 40 minutes, right?
Yeah, we go for an hour, I figured.
Yeah, we're going to go for an hour. And we have 1 or 2 people saved. I think I discussed this with you who want to have a slightly lengthier exchange, like, back and forth slight with your fans. We have screened the trolls for now, at least, right? So I don't think it should be a problem. So,
Yeah, no worries.
Yeah, I'm going to announce it right now.
And also, if you want to take a minute or so to introduce yourself, that might.
Yeah. So
might
just take a minute, take a break, and I'm gonna announce it right now. Okay. So, all right. So we still have like a minute left before the official thing starts.
Yeah, no worries.
And you guys can ask, can either, you guys have an option, you can, here we can read out the questions or you can ask them yourself. And yeah, I think we're ready. So Michael, I'm going to read out the first question we received. This was actually about a week before you actually joined. So this question was, I remember the user, but the question is, how did you get the name Inspiring Philosophy and what was the inspiration behind it? No pun intended.
So are we live now?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Well, okay. So the name actually came from a little bit of trying to find thinking of a good name and also trying to check what was available on Google. I think one of my first checks was Coffee Table Philosophy, which at the time was taken. Another one was the Aspiring Philosopher, which was also taken. So after just trying to come up with like a philosophy name for a channel, I came with Inspiring Philosophy. And that seemed to be my favorite pick at the time. But I wanted like a channel that would be about things. I didn't want to pick something like, Thunderfoot, because I wanted my channel to be about what I'm actually going to be talking about. So that was kind of the inspiration behind it. A little bit of just trying to think of a channel that would be more philosophy oriented, and it was also available on YouTube.
All right. So next question comes from Sasha. Sasha, I'm going to unmute you now, and you can ask the question yourself. Go ahead.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, so I saw your video on free will, and from that I assumed you're a libertarian on free will, right? Is that correct?
Yeah, I'm libertarian on free will, yeah. I'll probably be redoing that video next year, though, by the way.
I see. So my question is, in an instance where an agent, you'd say, has a free choice, what accounts for him choosing A rather than B?
Okay, so that's a good question. So this is going to relate to consciousness, because I don't think it's possible to talk about free will without invoking consciousness. The simple answer is the agent does. And the obvious reply is, okay, well then, what was it just a random choice, or was he determined by something? That's typically what a determinist or a compatibilist would throw back. And this is why I said I'd bring up consciousness, because I would argue that consciousness is unlike anything else in in reality itself. So I wouldn't even say it's a thing, a process, a function. It's a category of its own. So things are experienced in consciousness, functions are experienced in consciousness, but consciousness itself is neither of those. It's not a thing, it's not a function, it's a category of its own. And so because of that, when people try to say, well, was it determined or was it just a random selection? I think they're committing a category error. They're trying to assume it's another physical process that is either determined or is like a random quantum process, and neither of those work because consciousness itself is something unlike anything else in existence. So in reality, what simply happens is the agent is self-aware, is able to recognize various influences, mediate between them and navigate between them and choose one that he or she so decides. So because consciousness is unlike anything else, I think it avoids that whole randomness or deterministic objection.
Isn't that
Go ahead.
Isn't that just some sort of, I don't know, special pleading or invoking a normative virtue?
How would it be special pleading?
I mean, I just don't really understand, like, if you're trying to map out some sort of space between determinism and randomness, like, just saying that it's something else doesn't really answer the question.
Well, I could see where you're coming from, but let me reply like this, is that it's simply that studying the basic ontology of consciousness would entail that it's unlike anything else. It's not a physical process. Using John Sear's Chinese room argument, we can see it's not like a computer or anything. I mean, the mind itself is composed of elements of integrated information, I guess we could say. Basically, our mental processes are composed of thoughts, memories, dreams, whatever you want to call it. that's all integrated into the conscious self, the I or the ego. And so when people say, well, what part of the self or what part, of you or what thought or different memory determined you to act in that way, I would say you're sort of trying to reduce the agent to little physical parts or just indistinguishable little parts. And I would argue that consciousness itself, the conscious agent, is irreducible. So you cannot reduce the agent past itself to smaller parts and whatnot. And so, sure, you could argue that I am special pleading if you could show that consciousness is another physical process. Since I don't think consciousness is, I think consciousness is irreducible. And I think based on what we know about our own conscious experience, it cannot be another physical thing. So it wouldn't be special pleading. It would only be special pleading if you could show that it's like another physical process, because special pleading is saying these two things are the same and you're treating one special. Since I'm arguing consciousness is different, it's not special pleading.
All right, question from Godless Girl. Who do you consider the most deliberately dishonest famous atheist? And which famous atheist is the biggest clown?
Oh my gosh, do I have to do this?
You don't have to answer that.
I have opinions about that, but I want to try to not resort to that as much as I can. There are atheists, I think, that make bad arguments. No doubt. I'm not going to say any of them are clowns, even though I may personally think that, even though I probably shouldn't. But yeah, if I'm going to say people that make bad arguments, I can think of bad arguments by the friendly atheist who still argues from Horace to this day, or I've seen some pretty bad arguments from someone called Godless Engineer. Richard Dawkins, of course, still has bad arguments. Yeah. Anyone who argues that, who created God is just, making a bad argument.
Michael, this is a good time to clarify that any question or inquiry that you're not comfortable with, you can simply say and we move on. Okay, so
no worries.
Yeah, so if you feel that either like a question or someone asking you follow-up questions is either getting repetitive or you simply don't feel like answering, say I want to move on, and that's fine. Nobody, that's an agreement.
All right, no worries.
Yeah, next question. So next question comes from Brenda, who wants to ask you it herself personally. So Brenda, you're unmuted. Sure. You can go ahead.
Yes, I want to ask about information. What information is? So if I have a text file and I place in that text file spaghetti, the word spaghetti, and it has 6, 7 letters in it, and it has so many bytes of information in it. If I then open up that text file and then rearrange the letters, have I lost information?
Well, that's a good question. It really will depend. In terms of mental information, you could make the argument that rearranging letters has lost the meaning of the word behind it. Now, that, of course, is going to go down a very long road of philosophy of language, which I'm not. That's not my favorite subject. It might be useful to define information. So there's a famous paper.
Could you please? Yes.
Sure. There's a famous paper called A Mathematical Theory of Communication by C.E. Shannon. And anyone who's talking about information, this paper probably will come up. And basically, information is the properties of a system associated with the system's possible configurations. It's not an entity or an ontological class unto itself.
Right. So that would refute what you just said.
How so?
You said if I rearrange the letters that I've lost information. I've not lost information because it's just a different configuration.
It's a different configuration of the letters there.
Now, and there's no loss of information. There is no loss of information.
Well, hold on. Let me respond now. Okay, so I didn't get to the point where I'm going to define information in terms of materialism or idealism. So if materialism is true, information refers to material arrangements. Now, if materialism is true, you are right, because all you did was rearrange different letters and all the information is still technically there. Now, if idealism is true, information refers to phenomenal states that can be qualified or discerned from one another. So examples are qualia, sound, sensations, thoughts, emotions, or mental phenomena. Now, if you rearrange the letters, sure, you might be making a good point that information is not necessarily lost in that sense, that all the letters are still there. However, you could lose meaning. Now, if you want to define, in terms of meaning, we could say that is a form of information, and we have somehow either coded the meaning, I guess you could say, if you don't want to say it's lost, but you could also argue that it was sort of lost by changing the letters around if idealism is true. But now, of course, we're talking about mental information in and of itself. So now I get kind of where you're going from, because I mean, Leonard Susskind has argued, from the holographic principle, information is never lost. That was one of Stephen Hawking's blunders. And that's in terms of the physics of the universe. In terms of mental information, though, that would be another topic in and of itself. And I'm not really sure where I would fall on that. I think you're making a good point that it's not really lost because the letters are still there. But one could, I guess, argue that the meaning in terms of the mental quality has been lost. But you can respond.
Blocked. I can respond. Well, could you point me to official sources that talk about this immaterial spiritual meaning of information as opposed to the physical meaning?
Sure, you can check out the book by philosopher of mind Bernardo Kastrup, who wrote a book called The Idea of the World, and he talks about the differences there. And I'm not talking about in terms of spiritual. We're just talking about if idealism is true, or we're talking about mental properties. I mean, we all agree. We all agree mental properties exist.
Yeah, I was hoping for a mathematical treatment of this spiritual, non-material meaning of information, as opposed to the standard in the literature definition of information by Shannon.
Well, that would be impossible. Because I'm talking about idealism. Yeah. Mathematics describes physical equations. It doesn't describe anything immaterial. So that would be just impossible, and it's not even in the ballpark of what I'm trying to get at.
Right, Detroit, do you want to read out the next question?
Yeah, so we had a question from Marcus, and he was wondering if you were familiar with Darth Dawkins, and if you're also familiar with presuppositional apologetics, if you had any thoughts on that.
I think I'm familiar. I think I came across Darth Dawkins when I was preparing to debate Destiny last fall, and I saw a debate between him and Destiny. So, yes, unfortunately, I think I am familiar with him and his tactics, and I am familiar with presuppositional apologetics, which I firmly reject.
Could you elaborate on why you reject it?
Yeah, I reject presuppositional apologetics because apologetics is a tactic for giving answers to defend Christianity. And I find no biblical support for presuppositional apologetics. All the verses I see precepts using are taken out of context, or they're not being used in an apologetic effort. The Bible is very much, when people are doing apologetics, like Acts 17 is a great example, it's very much in the classical mode. Paul refers to pagan poets in that chapter to make his case. Precepts like to say that the Bible never appeals to anything outside of the Bible to make its case, which is just blatantly false. Matthew 6, Jesus appeals to nature. He says, consider the lilies of the field or the birds of the air to know that your Father will care for you. I mean, he appeals to nature itself to make his case. And another good example is Elijah. When he confronts the prophets of Baal on the hill, he performs a miracle to show them. In the book of Exodus, God says, I will bring about the plague so they will know that I am the Lord. What is it? What am I thinking? John 14, Jesus says, believe on the works I have shown you. I mean, there's just so many examples of classical or evidential apologetics. And I see no evidence of anyone saying, believe the Bible because the Bible says it's true, which, of course, the Bible wasn't really composed as it was back then anyway.
Well, supposing someone convinced you otherwise about the biblical facts, do you think it might be, in that case, a legitimate strategy?
If you could show it, sure. But at the same time, we have to remember another important aspect of apologetics. We have to, first of all, base our arguments and beliefs on biblical authority, of course. But we also have to remember that we have to, when we're doing apologetics, we're trying to appeal to the culture it brought. Paul says, I become all things to all men. To those under the law, I become like those under the law. Paul himself says we have to mold ourselves to adapt to the culture to win souls over. I see presuppositional apologetics in today's culture being extremely unsuccessful. Now, there are instances where it is. I'm not going to say it is never. But in terms of dealing with the modern skeptics, their modern society that's very much built on scientism or logical positivism, or very much just a very weak form of scientism, I guess you could say, I would see evidential or classical apologetics to be the best approach in today's society. So, sure, if you could make a biblical case, sure, but I'm going to challenge that, as I've said, and even if you could convince me, I would still say I probably would not be the best approach for today's culture.
Michael, question to you from Darwin's Greatest Hits. What is your metaphysical primary from which you derive all facts?
My metaphysical primary from which I derive all facts. Could he clarify a little bit? Because I want to make sure we're on the same page here. Could he? Because that's a little vague.
Darwin's greatest hits. Please clarify your question. In the meantime, we have Michael who wants to ask you his own question. Michael, you're unmuted now. Go ahead.
Hi. So on the Christian, can you hear me? Sorry.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Great. So on the Christian worldview, God is free when he creates, and he couldn't have in principle not created and still been fully God. Now, Aquinas makes a distinction between absolute necessity and necessity by supposition. So he would say that absolute necessity is when the predicate forms part of the definition of the subject, thus it is absolutely necessary that man is an animal. Now, in this way, it is not necessary that Socrates sits, wherefore it is not necessary absolutely, though it may be so by supposition, for granted that he is sitting, he must necessarily sit as long as he is sitting. So in this sense, Aquinas states that creation is necessary by supposition. Now, in what sense can it be said that God's willing to create is free if we were to relate that to the modal sense in creating in every single possible world?
Okay, so there was a lot there. Okay, so let me just make sure I understand what you're getting at. We're basically asking what in one sense God is free to create, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so yeah, I would argue God is not free to do evil. I don't believe God can freely do evil in that sense, like we are. Building off of someone like William Lane Craig or Alvin Plantinga, God is free in the sense of what universe he chooses to create. There's a philosopher named Keith Ward. I'm trying to remember the name of the book here. I have it on my shelf, but I can't find it. Oh, it's Divine Action. So one of the things he brings up in the book is he brings up the objection: why, if God is going to bring out the best of all possible futures, are we free at all? And he makes the argument that, well, that's assuming there is just one best possible future. There could be multiple, and there probably are multiple best possible futures. So God is free to bring about the best possible world from the collection of all the best possible worlds out there. So he creates in his freedom from there. So again, as I said, when you brought up a lot with regards to Aquinas and what he argues, are we still on the same page, or am I missing what you're getting at here?
Well, it's more, at the very least, as I understand it, we would have to affirm that God could have created and retained his absolute goodness, and God could have not created and retained his absolute goodness. So in that sense, God's creation is not something intrinsic to his nature, but it is something that he freely willed. I'm just asking, in what sense can it be said that God freely willed to create?
Right. Okay. And so then I think we are on the same page. In the sense that God freely willed to create, he could choose whichever of the best possible worlds he decided to. So they're building off Keith Ward. I would say there are multiple best possible worlds that are equally good, and he was picked of those worlds he wanted to create.
But you would say then that God necessarily had to create. It just didn't have to be a specific world.
That's a good question. I do not know if God necessarily had to create. I don't think he necessarily had to, because of course he's God and he is of course perfect within his Trinity. So I do not think he had to create. He could have not created and still been perfectly good, but God is like the artist who just chose to pick one of the best possible worlds and create from there. I don't think God had to create, or didn't have to create. Because he is an artistic, creative being, he chose to.
So would you say then that there's some possible world in which God did not create?
In terms of logical possible worlds, yes.
All right, so we have a question from, I actually don't remember what the guy's name was. He actually asked me in advance. What is your stance on Molinism?
Molinism? Is that what you said?
Yeah, Molinism.
Well, yeah, I hold to Molinism. I did a video called The Omniscience Paradox Debunked, and I defended that. I also used it in my video on the problem of evil.
I see. So, next question comes from Godless Girl, who wants to ask you: even if you knew that God did not exist, would you still want to believe in him, and why, if so?
If I knew that God did not exist, would I still want to believe in him? Here's my position on that. I would not believe in him because I would not believe he existed. I wouldn't really tell anyone or make a big deal about it because I know from studying psychology and social science that religion is overwhelmingly beneficial for society. This is what I understand some of the popular atheists to go out there and do this. They're actually doing more harm than good if you're going to base your arguments on science, because the evidence shows extensively that belief in religion, specifically intrinsic religiosity, is overwhelmingly beneficial for society. So I would just probably become like an investment banker and try to get rich and then live the rest of my life and die. I mean, I wouldn't really go out and tell anyone or make arguments for atheism or arguments against theism. I would just say, well, it's good that the current society is religious, and I would just live my life. I mean, my boss for several years was an atheist, and that was his position.
All right. We have another question from Benito171, kind of Euthyphro style question. So if God is the good, then it is his internal reasons, like his subjective motivational set of being loving, just, etc., that motivate his moral commands. If that is the case, would not his moral commands be subjective and therefore arbitrary? Or are there external reasons that motivate God's moral commands as well?
Yeah, it's Euthyphro's dilemma. So the way to get out of this is to point out that God simply is the good itself. So what you cannot start... Here's the problem when people do this sort of moral ontology. They start with God, and then they try to derive moral commands from there. If you're going to make a moral argument, you have to start with moral facts or moral duties and values, and then show that necessarily just is a personal source. So when you're studying things like moral values and duties, specifically like moral obligations, obligations are prescriptive in that sense. I can prescribe for you to it would point back to of course, some sort of personal source that we would call God. That's the basis of the moral argument. So the problem with the Euthyphro's dilemma, I would say, is it starts with God and then tries to derive moral obligations, moral duties from that. And the very essence, the very ontology of moral duties and values implies that they are personal in and of themselves. So another analogy to explain this is think of yourself and your personality. Your personality is composed of your thoughts, your dreams, your emotions, your goals, your memories. If you take away your personality, you would not be you, but your personality is still contingent upon you. Likewise, the good is dependent upon God. It's like how our personality is dependent upon us. The good is God, and it's also dependent upon God, like our personality is us and dependent upon us.
Yeah, so next question comes from Doorman, who wants to ask his question himself. So Doorman, you're unmuted.
Yo, it's good. Big fan.
Thank you.
So I know you made a video about the cosmological argument, the modal ontological argument. Of the classic arguments, and I guess this is a two-part question. Which one do you think is the most compelling?
Probably cosmological still.
Okay, perfect. So would you say are you talking about PSR-based cosmological arguments?
Sorry, what?
Are you talking about PSR-based cosmological arguments?
Yeah.
What form of the PSR would you say you think is the best?
Probably still the Leibnizian version, specifically Alexander Pruss's formulation of it.
Pruss gives a bunch of different ones. But
I'm specifically referring to the one he uses in the Blackwell's Companions to Natural Theology, because that's the one I used when I made the video on it.
Right. So how do you respond to people who think that it entails necessitarianism?
Entails what?
Necessitarianism.
Yeah, I responded in that video. If you give me a second, I can pull up my notes on it. But basically, I remember William Lane Craig and Pruss both responded to Peter Van Wegen on this, and they basically argued that you just have to reformulate the PSR to a certain degree, and you get around that idea. Now, I don't have my notes up in front of me. It takes me a while to find them, but
that's okay.
I remember I addressed it in that video. So if you want the details, it would be more in that video.
Gotcha. Keep doing the good work.
Thanks, appreciate it.
Norman, mute. Yeah. So the question comes again from Christian Idealism, who wants to ask you his question himself in voice chat. Christian Idealism, you're unmuted.
Hi, Kyle.
Hello. So I had a question about ethics. So I know you kind of make the distinction between normative ethics, meta-ethics, and then, of course, applied ethics. Now, my question is, I know you're not a natural law theorist, so what would be your normative ethics?
I'm more of a virtue ethicist.
Okay. No, well, I know, but like, which specifically? Like, is there a name that you? Because I know, like, virtue ethics is typically ascribed with natural law theory. So I'm wondering, like, what is your position?
Well, my position is basically, so if I were to build off, for example, Galatians, Galatians talks about the fruit of the Spirit. It's like we ought to obtain these types of goals. So if I were to explain my ethics, it's basically that I am trying to be, loving, joyful, peaceful, patient, kindness in that sense. If that's what you're getting at, because I'm not really sure what connection you're trying to make with natural law here.
No, I know, because natural law theory, I've been studying it a lot. It basically says that like morality is dependent upon like teleology, so like the purpose of things. So like, for example, like your purpose to walk is that your feet work, or your purpose to eat food is that you naturally nutrition yourself and feed yourself food, stuff like that. And they sort of use the same argument to argue against homosexuality and all the that's kind of like where you get the whole sexual ethics thing from. But anyways, so
to be honest, I'm still kind of agnostic on natural law itself. I think they do make some good points, to be fair.
Okay.
All right, Troyer, you want to read the next question out?
Yeah, so we have a question from Puro of Ellis. It was asking if you prefer classical or process theism, or if you have any thoughts on that.
Oh, I'm a classical theist. I'm not a theistic personalist, or I'm very much classical theism.
All right, and then we have a question from James SSC. He was wondering if you think we would still obey God's laws and commands, even if God declared that he was going to send all humans to hell forever, regardless what we did. But he still declared that the commands were, quote unquote, still in effect.
So that's a good question. I mean, we're talking about hypotheticals here, so of course I can be hypothetical. If in this speculative environment we're all going to hell, well, first it depends on what we mean by hell. Are we talking about just eternal separation from God and like darkness? Or are we talking about the Dante's Inferno's version where people are being poked with pitchforks and all that stuff? I mean, if we're the argument could be like, just be hedonistic and just, live as much, to get as much pleasure as you possibly could, because pleasure feels good. Another argument could be made is that ultimately following God's commands is ultimately going to feel better for us, because that's how we were designed, to follow God's laws and commands. So, I mean, it's speculative. So I don't really know at that point, because it's not actual. It's not something I would really know what to do if I was in that universe. But I mean, those are two possibilities.
All right, we have Spirit Plumber in line, who actually wants to address you himself in voice chat. Spirit, you're unmuted.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi. My question to you is, how would your theology deal with an outside context problem? And for an example, let's say that your, whatever you believe for the end times starts happening, but then it stops because, I don't know, we start using space lasers to shoot demons. Or, Cthulhu shows up and eats the world before God can end it the way that it says in the Bible. How would you react to that?
So you're using an example, and so every different circumstance is going to be different. I couldn't really make a sweeping generalization here. In that type of circumstance, what is this noise?
Someone invited rhythm in here.
I don't know. I heard a really loud noise. So anyway, back to the thing. In terms of that circumstances, well, first of all, my eschatology is I'm a post-millennialist, so I don't believe in end-time tribulation stuff. I believe that the world is going to keep getting better over the next 10 to 12,000 years until the millennial kingdom begins. So I'm not one of those end times left behind book series people. I very much am against that idea. So in terms of that context, I mean, I don't know, because I don't really hold to that end times view. But in terms of it really depends on the circumstances we're talking about here. The reaction is always going to have to be different.
Right. Our next question comes from Jonathan, who, if I remember correctly, is Oriental Orthodox, and they want to ask you: do you accept the idea of invincible ignorance?
Invincible ignorance.
Yes, so basically, this is the idea that someone can be ignorant of the Christian faith, and thus answer won't be demanded from them in the same way it would have been demanded from someone who was knowledgeable, right? So, for example, someone can be sinning without knowing. So that's invincible ignorance. Do you accept that idea?
I honestly do not know if I accept that or not. I feel like I need a little bit more context because I've heard that term used in different contexts. Are we talking about maybe like people who've never heard of the gospel, like people that were born on American Samoa in the year 480?
Basically, yes.
Yeah. Okay. So my view on that is
Jonathan actually wants to himself clarify.
Okay.
I didn't know he didn't. Yeah. Let me unmute.
Yeah, my bad. What's up, IP?
Hi, how you doing?
Basically the idea. Yeah, what's up? Basically the idea of invincible ignorance is that you basically had it is that somebody doesn't know of the gospel through no fault of their own.
Right.
So like an African tribesman or something.
Yeah.
Would you say they're going to heaven or hell, or do you not know?
So I responded to this in my video on hell. So the title was "Does God Send People to Hell?" And I basically argued from John 9:41 and John 15:22, and I can also use Romans 5:13 that God doesn't send people to hell for ignorance. Now, then the obvious response to that is, well, then we shouldn't do mission work because if they stay ignorant, they're going to go to heaven. And my reply is, that doesn't mean they're going to heaven either. I don't think this simplistic understanding of heaven and hell needs to work, or is actually pragmatic, or actually is what is going on here. That, if I think the afterlife is a little bit more complex. In terms of the afterlife, I've said I'm a legal universalist, and that I believe that the only people that are in hell are the people who want to be there. So everyone who's in heaven wants to be there, and everyone who is in hell wants to be there. So when people are not given the gospel, they obviously don't have enough information, or they don't have proper information to make a full choice. Giving them the gospel allows them to make a better choice, but that doesn't condemn them to hell, and that doesn't mean they get a free ticket to heaven either. It's a little bit more complicated. We're not omniscient at the end of the day, and that, since God is perfectly just, he knows what to do in those situations, not us.
Would you still hold that, like, let's take a scenario where someone is invincibly ignorant and they actually do go to heaven because maybe, although they've sinned a couple times, maybe they lived a generally, like, okay life. Would you hold that it's still... Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I mean, sin does not send people to hell, so it's hard for me to follow the analogy there, because, I mean, if sin sent us to hell, we'd all be in hell.
No, what I mean is that, like, obviously there's a sense in which we need to be cleansed from our sin, though, in order to be in heaven. So if there was someone who's invincibly ignorant, would you still hold that Christ cleanses them of their sin, but they just don't know they're being cleansed of their sin by Christ, if that scenario is true?
Again, it would really depend on the person, and this is why I bring up the idea of omniscience. When we get into these specific hypotheticals, it's very hard to say, because we don't know their heart, we don't know their choices, we don't know how God could be working with them. I would go back to what I said earlier, in that no one goes to hell for ignorance. The only people that are in hell want to be there. Sin doesn't send them to hell. What sends them to hell is wanting them to be their own Lord, to be their own master, to want to build their own personal kingdom. Some people who never heard of Christ want to do that, and some people may have want to do that. I would also add that I don't think that most people who've lived on Earth have not heard of God in some sense. And I would refer you to a video I did called The Case for Ancient Monotheism, where I went around to all these various cultures and showed that many of them are monotheistic and have very similar ideas to what we find in the Judeo-Christian culture, like Australian Aboriginal tribes, various Native American tribes, etc. So I would say that they very well could be working towards God or the ultimate good. And if they submit themselves to that in their sense, I don't see they'd be condemned to hell. I would also say, though, they still need to be sanctified by Christ, and that could happen after death in some sort of like neo-purgatorian state, I guess.
All right, thanks. All right. So we had a two-part question from Raiden earlier. First, he was wondering if you'd be willing to give Jay Dyer another chance for debate.
So the first thing I'll say about Jay Dyer is no, because if you watch what happened after that big fiasco, the crap he said on Twitter and on his own channel about us being like retarded and everything, he's obviously not worth a respectful conversation. I'm not going to debate Jay Dyer for the same reason I'm not going to dive in a dumpster. because I don't want to get dirty. If he matures and apologizes and acts like a man, I'll consider it, but it would be a structured debate. I don't trust him in free, open conversation right now. But I don't suspect he's going to do that, and I don't see any sort of repentance or for the way he acted, or especially the way he treated a friend of mine, which is Cameron. So I have no reason to go dumpster diving.
Fair enough. And the second part was, how sure are you about evolution being true?
I'm very, very sure that evolution happened, especially the more I study it. The more I've read Stephen Meyer and his horrible arguments, which are don't even get me started on his arguments from the Cambrian explosion itself, or protein sequence space. But I think at this point it's pretty sure evolution did happen. I don't think neo-Darwinianism can fully explain evolution. I think there's a lot of evidence in an extended evolutionary synthesis that evolution did happen, drawing from self-assembly processes, evo-devo, niche construction. At this point, we have a ton of evidence, especially in terms of evo-devo. We now know radical mutations can happen that are beneficial from just duplicating sequences or slightly rearranging them, thanks to the research in evo-devo. So at this point, I'm pretty much... I know evolution happened to the same degree I know God exists. I would say I probably know God exists a little bit more than evolution, but it's pretty close.
All right, fair enough. And we have another question from Benito171. He asked, John Walton seems to argue that the Canaanites weren't being punished for sin, like, for example, child sacrifice. Do you agree with him on this? And second, why did God command the killing of women and children?
So I would need to go back and read John Walton again on his book on the Lost World of the Conquest, because it's been a while since I read it, and when I was reading it, I was also focusing on Genesis mostly, so I probably brushed through a little faster than I should. When I get back to the Conquest, I will reread the book and get back to it. In terms of my views, I'm very aligned with Paul Copan or Richard Hess on this, that they were being punished for sin, like child sacrifice, child prostitution, all these things. Clay Jones wrote a paper on the Canaanites, and you could see there's a lot of horrible things they did, like Plutarch talks about it as well. There's another book, Karen Ray Namitnijat, who wrote a book on Mesopotamia, and it does spill over to Levant, but they would, they would attack cities, kill the men, take the women and children back as slaves. A lot of the girls would end up as temple prostitutes. All these horrible things that happened in Mesopotamia, and spilled over into the Levant as well. So these were not good people. So yeah, they were being punished. In terms of God ordering the killing of women and children, I think Paul Copan and Douglas Jacoby do a good job in their book, Did God Command Genocide?, to show that that really wasn't happening. This is hyperbole. If you go through the Pentateuch, God uses the phrases drive them out of the land more so than kill all the inhabitants. In fact, kill all the inhabitants is used as sort of like a hyperbolic restatement of that. So it's more about them driving the people out of the land. It's very much compared to Egyptian steles in terms of their war conquest, as well as Assyrian war conquest, where they talk about going in and slaughtering the whole civilization, but really they just meant they won a battle. I know Karen Ray Namitnijat talks about how they would go in and they would say they slaughtered entire cities, and then they would come back say, oh, we brought this many slaves back. Well, wait a minute. If you brought slaves back, that means you didn't really kill everyone like you said. Well, it's ancient Near Eastern hyperbole. It was like they utterly annihilated them. They utterly defeated them. It's not that they actually went in and murdered all the women and children. For example, Jericho was a fort. It's where it was like an outside fort that would be protecting the land and whatnot. If you're going to go in and slaughter, when you're going to go in and kill everyone, it's mostly going to be male soldiers in there and whatnot. And so I think when we read Joshua, we understand the hyperbolic nature of what's going on in there, and same way we understand Egyptian steles when they talk about their own war conquest, like Thutmose III or Ramesses II.
All right, Godless would like to ask a question on VC. So if Godless can unmute, oh sorry, it's a roll, I guess. Kane, how do I unmute Godless?
Yeah, Godless is muted for some reason. I don't know what the... she has to unmute herself, but...
She's unmuted on her end, I guess?
Yeah, let's try... response to that?
Quite simply, God is omniscient, knows every aspect of us, and knows the best way to communicate us to get a message across as best as it can be told while taking in free will. So, I mean, people are going to misunderstand or whatnot in terms of their own psychology, but that's another story in and of itself. But mainly, I would say God is omniscient, can know the best way to communicate.
Right. So, okay. So again, question from James SC, who wants to ask: does inspiring philosophy consider Islam a threat to Christian societies or Christians worldwide? And does he think governments or individuals do something differently than Islam or Muslims?
So you were breaking up a little bit. Can you repeat that?
Yeah, sorry. His question is basically: does IP consider Islam to be a threat to Christian societies, and should governments do something different about Islam?
I do think Islam can be a threat to Christian society. I don't think government is a good solution. I mean, just look at how our government is handling the current pandemic. I don't think they're the best at handling that. I think the best way to handle Islam is the same way the early church handled the Roman Empire. Evangelism, apologetics, persecution.
Right. And Godless Girl, yes, Godless is back. I will unmute her. Godless Girl, are you on? Yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, okay. Do God's thoughts occur in succession?
In my view, no, because it depends on what we're talking about. So God in his essence is wholly timeless through God's energy. So, as he manifests as Christ, when he was human, of course, his thoughts would have to concur in succession. So it really depends. This is a lot of early church fathers spent a lot of time talking about the difference between the energies and the essence of God.
So does God know what time it is right now?
Well, yeah, God knows what time it is right now.
So is his belief when it changes from this moment to another, did that belief precede the next belief about what time it is?
Could you say that again? Sorry.
Yeah, right now he believes that it's 10:06 p.m. When he no longer believes that, and he believes it's 10:07 p.m., did the belief that it was 10:06 p.m. precede the belief that it was 10:06 p.m.?
Yeah, in Christ's nature as a human, yes, it does, because he is been incarnate. So yeah, he would have an experience of time through that, even in his resurrected body. I would argue.
Some of his beliefs occur in succession. You're saying
through the energies of God, yes.
So when God's first belief when he first had a belief that preceded another belief, came after another belief. Was that caused?
Was that caused?
Yeah.
Well, if God has entered into time, I mean, it would be the same way that our beliefs are experienced.
Yeah. So next question comes from Steve, who again wants to ask the question himself. Steve, you are unmuted now.
So I'm kind of confused. Is this guy a Christian or what?
Me?
Yes, are you a Christian?
Yes.
Okay, then never mind. I don't have any questions.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah, Steve seems to have been a troll. I guess I should have. Didn't get too far there. So
no worries.
Yeah. So I hope you won't quit our server because of that. So Michael, our next question comes. What do you think about modern critical scholarship of the Bible? What is your opinion about people who believe that the Bible or parts of the Bible have been misinterpreted by Christians for centuries? And true research shows something completely different. What is your response to that?
Well, I mean, it's very possible. I mean, I don't think core doctrines have been misinterpreted, but I mean, sure, there's a debate, especially in regards to the scholarship around the new perspective on Paul, that some passages have been slightly misunderstood. But I mean, if you read someone like N.T. Wright, he's not changing core Christian doctrines. He's just saying, let's understand them through a different path. We're still going to arrive at the same conclusion, but we need to understand it more in terms of being welcome into a family of God instead of individual salvation. Now that could still be done. So it's a lot of it seems to me is I don't think people need to fret so much about it. I think it can be very helpful. Like I think, for example, if I can think of an example, like for example, in Revelations, there's one passage where Jesus says, "You are neither hot nor cold. I will spit you out of my mouth." And if you grew up like me, every time the pastor got out there and said, "See, Jesus would rather you be against him entirely than just be in the middle ground." That's probably not what Revelation is getting at. It's actually more like, cold water is useful, hot water is useful, lukewarm water is not useful at all. So be cold water, be cool and refreshing and be useful in one way, or be hot water that's, soothing and warm in one way. But lukewarm water is useless. It's neither cold and refreshing or hot and soothing. So I think modern scholarship can be helpful. Now we have a better understanding of that passage that was being misunderstood for several years.
All right, so Sasha wants to get and ask you on VC himself. So Sasha, you're unmuted now.
Yeah, hey. So I've seen you use the ontological argument a lot. Do you still hold it to be a convincing, good argument?
I still hold it. It's a useful argument. I would not say it's my favorite or the most convincing anymore. I've kind of moved on. I think it still works, though. I think it's still sound.
I mean, what do you think about the criticism that it begs the question?
Oh, I did a video on that called Ontological Argument, question begging, ? I know I don't think it begs the question because you actually, in formal logic, you can distinguish between circular reasons and begging the question. Something doesn't beg the question if it offers to inform. So I did a video on that. If you want to check it out, I go into more detail there.
I mean, I've seen it a while ago, but just as far as I've seen, your video on the ontological argument, you said that if premise one is true, then it all just follows from premise one. It just seems like there's just one premise that's equivalent to your conclusion. I don't really understand. So the argument I use in there is more like a very simplified version. Let's be honest there. It does follow from that it would just logically follow to the next ones, but as philosophers have noted, that doesn't necessarily mean it's begging the question if you're informing. And through the ontological argument, you are informing that the reason why God is in all possible worlds is because of necessity, the property of necessity. So in the first premise alone, you're not entirely informed about the conclusion. You need the rest of the argument to be informed about the conclusion. So you could argue it's circular, but it doesn't beg the question in that sense.
Right. So next question comes from Crispy, who's telling you, which of your Christian belief interpretations of Scripture puts you most at odds with the common personalist Christian folk around you?
Okay, so hold on. You kind of broke up a little bit. So are we talking about, do you mean theistic personalism, or are you talking about just common Christian beliefs?
Yeah, so which of your Christian beliefs or interpretations of Scripture put you most at odds with the common personalist folk around you?
Oh, probably my belief in evolution, honestly. I mean, I know a lot of Christians that don't believe in evolution. I'm trying to change that, and I hope I can make progress on that. But probably that. Maybe my idealism as well, because I think substance dualism is pretty intuitive. And so most people are substance dualists, I feel like. And idealism is not really that popular. So maybe one of those two.
Yeah, so... Yeah, before the trailer, there's one more we want on VC. It's Doorman. Doorman, you're unmuted now. Okay, so, yeah. Unmute yourself. Can you unmute yourself? Yeah.
Wait, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Cool. So, IP, I was just wondering what your views are on, like a God's eye view, metaphysical realism, anti-realism.
So, could you clarify a little bit more about that then? Because we're talking about God's view.
No, go ahead. Sorry.
Okay, yeah. Just please clarify a little bit more, because that seems a little vague, and I want to make sure we're on the right page.
Well, I'll just start with a simple example, right? So, do you think metaphysical realism is true or false?
Yeah, I think I'm a metaphysical realist because I'm not a subjective idealist in that sense.
Okay, so would you say that there is some kind of way that the world is that you can appreciate from like a God's eye view?
Okay, so now I see where we're coming from. So I want to be careful how I word this so I don't contradict myself in one of my videos. Because yes, I do agree that in the what's the word I'm looking for? Not specifically that God has a giant eye looking down at us, but just in terms of the colloquial sense of God's eye view. Yeah, there is a realistic way to look at the universe because I am an objective idealist. So I don't think that it changes between subjects. I guess is that what you're getting at?
Yeah, that's close enough.
Okay.
Right. So next question actually comes from what's his name? Didi Robbie, I think. So he's asking, if aliens existed, would that disprove your theology in its entirety or at least in part?
No, because I've actually argued for aliens in one of my videos titled "Was Life Inevitable?" So yeah, I do think there's life all across the universe, and no, I don't think that would disprove anything. I think it would actually support one of my conclusions.
Yeah, Detroit, you want to?
Yeah, going back to part of the discussion earlier, Dark Defender asked, do you actually believe that some people want to go to hell?
Yeah. I mean, look at Christopher Hitchens. Christopher Hitchens says, I don't want to be in heaven with the dear leader. Dan Barker said, if God did exist, I would tell him to go to hell. These people don't want to be with God. They want to be separated from him. So again, hell is not like a torture chamber that God is chucking souls into. Hell is a freely chosen identity built on something else besides God going on forever. So these people, when they die, they reject God. They don't want to be in His presence. They go out into the abyss.
All right. And Hagar wanted to ask if you think your critiques of error theory are still good from that error theory video you posted.
Oh, error theory? I thought you said A theory.
Error theory.
Yeah, I worked with an atheist on that video. One of the hosts of Real Theology. So, yeah, I still think they're useful and good. I mean, it's been a while since I did it. I have to go back and refresh myself. But yeah, I think it was. I don't think J.L. Mackey's arguments were really that good. I think he was kind of assuming his conclusion a lot in places.
All right, and I think Misanthropic wanted to ask a question in VC. So, Mary, if you're there.
Yeah. Hey, so I was just curious, right? In the modal ontological argument, what reason does someone who doesn't already accept the conclusion of the argument have to accept the first premise? And if there is no such reason, how is it not question begging?
So talk about the first premise itself. So the first premise is basically, God is metaphysically possible. Now, the argument we get is most atheists tend to accept that. Then the ontological argument just informs us that if you accept that God is metaphysically possible, based on his ontology, he would be also a necessary being. So if he is metaphysically possible and ontologically necessary, the only way God cannot exist is for him to be metaphysically impossible or logically impossible. So it puts more of a burden on the atheist to argue that God is actually impossible. And they can attempt to do that through things like, omnipotence paradox, I guess, for example. So the point of the OA is to basically point out that, look, if you're going to accept from maybe the cosmological or teleological argument that God is at least metaphysically possible, you're basically supporting the ontological argument takes you the step to argue that it's logical. Doesn't prove, but it's logical to accept that God actually does exist.
Yeah, so why should they accept that it's metaphysically impossible?
So if God is metaphysically possible, the only way... so they would need to argue God is metaphysically impossible. So if something is defined as necessary... Okay,
sorry. Sorry. I misheard you. But yeah, I'm curious about why is it why would they have to accept that it's metaphysically possible?
So
I don't understand why that they would have to accept that.
So we have to talk about what we mean by God. When theists are arguing for God, we're arguing for a necessary being. Now, you and I are contingent beings. There are possible worlds where we could not exist. If a necessary being exists, the only way for a necessary being to not exist is to be impossible. So let me give you an example. Let's say I would say I believe in a necessary cat. Okay, it'd be very easy to argue such a concept is impossible because a cat is a physical being. Physical beings require space and time, therefore they can't be necessary because necessity requires that they are not dependent on anything. So it's very easy to argue such a concept, a necessary cat, is impossible. It's not very hard to do the same thing with a necessary immaterial being, namely a maximally great being. So if you accept that such a being is possible, it follows that it's logical that such a being either exists or it's impossible.
So why should they accept that it's possible for there to be a metaphysically necessary being?
Oh, good. So in terms of metaphysics, we have arguments like the cosmological argument, the digital physics argument, the cosmic conscious argument, the introspective argument, the argument from reason, the resurrection argument, the teleological argument. All of these combined at least minimally show that such a being is possible. And then also it takes the ontological argument just to come in and go, by the way, if you're accepting that, if you at least accept possibility from these other arguments, you're basically getting to the conclusion we want anyway.
All right, so we have next question. Again, I don't... Mary, mute your microphone. Yeah, so I don't remember the name. They DM'd me like a week ago, but this is a question that I like. What is your relation with Catholics? How do you view Roman Catholicism?
Catholics are Christians.
Do you believe that Catholics can be saved?
Of course, they're Christians.
Oh, that's a really progressive view, I guess. Okay, so you want to read out the next questions?
Yeah, I had Bronson had a series of questions. So first, he was wondering what your views on homosexuality are.
Oh, good question. That's a very complicated subject. So here's my basic position in a nutshell. I would take arguments from Ephesians 5, I guess you could say, on this, which doesn't mention homosexuality, as I'm sure a lot of people would notice. It talks about marriage. So I have a hard time finding evidence that homosexuality is a moral sin, like stealing, rape, murder. I mean, those are moral sins because you're harming another person. Homosexuality doesn't. Two consenting adults can do whatever they want, I guess you could say. It's hard to argue. It's a moral sin. You know, like John Stuart Mill said, I could throw my fist around as much as I want as long as I don't hit you in the face. So it's hard for me to argue it's a moral sin. However, Ephesians 5 seems to talk about marriage in terms of a covenant between a man and a woman. So I would argue that homosexuality within Christianity is a covenantal sin. We're not called to be in these type of relationships because our marriages need to reflect our relationship with Christ and the body.
All right. You had a second question. Do you think you have some arguments for the existence of angels, demons, and other spiritual beings?
Let me... Oh, man. Maybe. I might actually be working on a video on that. However, based on my current schedule, it probably won't be out till June 2021. But I'm going to read a couple more books. I might have some interesting evidence I'm going to bring to light in the future. Right. I read a couple of researchers that through a couple of the studies they were doing, they became convinced that these beings actually do exist. And these are medical doctors. So I'll highlight their research probably next year. My goal is to get there by that point, but we'll see. I got to make sure all the research checks out before I go there.
All right. And one more question he had was, he was wondering what your view on the Trinity was. Is it one mind or three minds that are integrated? And he's also wondering about your thoughts on Swinburne's social theory of the Trinity.
If I recall, again, I would need to refresh myself on this because I'm like knee deep in neuroscientific papers right now and commentaries on Genesis. But I'm a social Trinitarian, so it's like one mind and three wills. But I mean, to me, a lot of those theological disputes it pique my interest as much.
All right.
Michael, may I ask you, how do you feel? Do you feel like we're just going, or do you feel like you're going to wrap this up? How are you going for 50 minutes?
Yeah, we can go for another 20 minutes or so, probably.
All right, so another 20 minutes. Detroyer, yes. So we'll have Josh. That's who we saved for last. So a couple of more questions you can read out, Detroyer.
Yeah, sure. Dark Defender had a question about the earlier discussion. He says, why doesn't God make himself clearer if he doesn't want people to go to hell? So it's kind of a hiddenness question.
Oh, that's a good question. Funny story. In about 2 weeks, I'll have a video on that. I'm going to go over a lot of psychological reports on biases and dogmatism, which will probably upset a lot of people, but I don't care. If you see a video I did called Divine Hiddenness, I covered that in detail. It's The title is Divine Hiddenness, Christian Response. You can also check out a conversation I had with Apologia on that back in December, I believe it was, on Shannon Q's channel. Basically, it's because humans very much make truth for ourselves. What we psychological reports have shown extensively that we all want to, we all sort of subconsciously pick beliefs we think we would like to believe, and then we find evidence to confirm them. Now, that's true of me, that's true of you listening to this right now. How do we fight it? I would say you submit your views to political discourse, and you debate them there and see if you're challenged. That's how I became to accept the theory of evolution. That's how I became an idealist. So I've changed several of my views, is trying to submit them to political discourse in a respectful manner. When it comes to like Christianity, I keep constantly submitting arguments like the resurrection argument and saying, look, if this is wrong, give me a better naturalistic explanation that's less ad hoc and more plausible. And I have not gotten a sound response since that. Instead, I get very, very absurd arguments are trying to just presuppose miracles are the least probable, which I think is a bad argument. So I don't know if I have time to get into that right now, or they just try to take their own subjective skepticism and assert it as some sort of objective fact. But that's a topic for another time. I would say that the reason why God is hidden, to bring this back around, is because humans believe what they want to believe. And to fight that, we have to try to engage in these types of conversations to combat that.
All right. Adam and Evie had a question. Why are you not a Catholic?
So that's a good question. I do attend Catholic Mass occasionally here in Tucson. The problem is Tucson's very liberal, and I don't really like a lot of the Catholic churches I've been to here. I would take conviction from 1 Corinthians chapter 1, where Paul says, who do I follow? Apollo? Do I follow Cephas? No, I follow Christ. So I call myself just a Christian. I don't call myself anything other than that. I don't want to ever claim a denomination. I don't even like calling myself non-denominational, because that has become a denomination now. So I tend to just say I'm a Christian, period, end of story, nothing else.
Fair enough. Hagar was wondering if you could give some succinct reason for why you think idealism is true.
Oh, good question. So a big reason I think idealism is true is just from basic philosophy. However, I do have arguments from neuroscience and, of course, quantum mechanics, cosmology, those type of arguments. But the easiest way I can explain it is think of everything we experience is mental. Nothing you experience is physical in terms of being another substance. So if you think of an apple, this is David Hume's bundle theory. You can describe an apple by its color, its shape, its hardness, what it tastes like, what it smells like. You're describing it all in terms of its mental properties, in terms of its mental information. Nothing you're ever describing is in terms of some sort of other physical substance. You're going to describe things in terms of qualia, sound, sensations, thoughts, mental phenomena. All of these things are mental. There's no reason to posit another substance beyond the mental. That's why I'm an idealist. Because the physical world itself just seems to be a mental phenomenon. Everything can be described mental. Why posit a second substance? It's ad hoc, or it's not parsimonious.
All right. Do we want to do more questions, or do you want to have Josh have a conversation?
Yeah, I think this is so. Michael, we saved the best for last, and here's Josh who wants to briefly engage with you, and then we'll have some concluding thoughts. Okay, and then we'll. Thanks for being here. So, Josh, are you ready right now? I'm going to unmute you. Let's see. And yeah, you remember the rules, right? You're uncomfortable. You can just say, I'm not comfortable with this, and we move on. Josh, can you hear us? Josh?
Yeah, you keep server muting me.
Oh, yeah. So, yeah, the floor is yours.
Okay, so I just want to be clear real quick on, do you have like a particular theory of omnipotence? Like, do you subscribe to an act-based view of omnipotence or a results-based view of omnipotence?
That's a good question. Trying to remember what I said in my video.
I mean, I don't really think it's important. Like, we could probably say a results-based view just for the sake of brevity. I just wanted to.
That's fine. Yeah.
Because the standard objections to an act-based view are that it's incoherent. Because that's the one where God both lift and not, and make himself not lift a stone or whatever, right?
Right. Yeah. So
a results-based view is something like God can do whatever is logically possible.
Mm-hmm.
That's sort of consistent with his things like his divine properties, like his moral nature and things like that, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so my view is that mentality, and specifically normativity, intentionality is normative, and that just means things like beliefs and desires have what are called accordance relations, right? And so the idea there is that it makes sense to say you're in accord with desires, and your beliefs are aimed at truth. And if they're not true, then in some sense your beliefs are failing, right? And if you don't get what you desire, then in some sense you're failing with respect to that desire. Do you agree with that, or?
Yeah. What's the question, though?
Okay, so the question then is, given that God can't fail, and it's constitutive of things like beliefs and desires, the possibility of failure, then how could God be an agent? How could God have mentality?
So can I ask for some clarification here? So basically, it's since God cannot fail, he's always going to succeed. It's more like he's like a computer program then? Is that what you're trying to get at here?
He's more like a mechanism.
So I would go back to what I said earlier with regards to Keith Ward in his book Divine Action, that it's not so much that there is one successful option, there are multiple successful options. So I could take aim from Scripture when, for example, God says to Hezekiah, you're going to die. And then Hezekiah calls out and cries for mercy, and God says, well, all right, now that you're piping up, I guess I'll let you live a couple more years. So in both of those circumstances, God would have been successful in his ultimate plan, but he chose a different path, but would have been equally got to the results he wanted regardless.
Right, but what I'm trying to say is that it's part of the nature of mentality that there's a possibility of failure, but it's true of God just on the hypothesis of omnipotence that he can't fail. Right.
I don't know if I follow on the first part that their failure has to be part of the equation there.
Right. So the reason that I'm saying that is because that's what demarcates. Normativity is what demarcates. I mean, I'm sure you've heard of something like the is-ought distinction, right?
Right.
So you can say something like, it's the case that God did this, but ought God to have done this? So it's not the case that just because God did something, he ought to have done something. But what that means is that if there's this distinction between what God ought to have done and what God did, it means that God has possibly failed. And if God has possibly failed, then God is not omnipotent.
So possibility is not the same. First, possibility is not the same as actuality, though. So I'm not sure how you're making this connection that God has to have the possibility to fail to not be a mental agent. Because, I mean, for example, let's say that Alexander the Great won Alexander the Great won almost every battle. Let's say he won literally every battle. That wouldn't mean he wasn't an agent.
No, but it's possible for Alexander the Great to have not won a battle. And so I take it that... Okay, go ahead.
But if it was actual, in terms of actuality, if it was actual that Alexander the Great won every battle, that wouldn't actually mean he's not an agent. Just because it's... But I mean, like, if we're talking about terms of possibility, I think we need to distinguish between metaphysical and logical possibility.
Well, I mean, it doesn't matter, like, because the point is that omnipotence, at least on the results-based view, is parasitic on on possibility, even if it's metaphysical possibility, right? It's the whole point is what makes someone omnipotent is that they can't fail with respect to their aims. And so it is a modal notion. It's not the same as when you're saying, oh, it's just contingently the case that some agent is always in accord with their aims. That's true, but it's always possible that they can fail. But that's to be distinguished between something like some sort of mechanism, right? Because mechanisms aren't aimed. If you said that the lightning bolt struck the lightning rod, it's not like the lightning bolt was aiming at the lightning rod, and had it missed, it would have failed to hit the.
So can I try to steel man your argument?
Sure.
So basically, it's that God cannot fail. So he's always going to do things, and they're always going to be successful. Therefore, he's like a mechanism and not an agent.
Yeah, logically possible. Whatever's logically possible for him to do. I'm not saying anything like God can do incoherent things.
So I would respond. I think it's almost like tunnel vision in terms of what it means to be an agent. I mean, what makes us agents is not just being successful or being able to fail. I mean, if I always won every single game of Yahtzee I ever played, that wouldn't mean I wasn't an agent when I was just playing Yahtzee within that specific circumstance. It would just mean that within that realm I'm pretty good at the game or I'm pretty lucky at the game. So let me get all this out before you respond, and then you can come back however you want. In terms of God always being successful, you could argue, yeah, he's always successful. I don't think that means he's not an agent, because I would define agency as something much broader. You know, he's self-aware, he's conscious. It just because he's able to do certain things. And I would also say that God has free will in some sense, that he's able to choose between different possible worlds that are all equally good, and he can pick from there. So if that's a sense, he's making choices, he's self-aware of who he is. That would be more of a defining moment in terms of agency. But the fact that he can always be successful, that doesn't mean he's some sort of like deterministic mechanism. It just means that he's not failing. But I guess I don't really see how that would remove his agency, because I don't think you and I are defining agency the same way.
Well, I just take agency to be things like beliefs and desires, right?
So let's go from there, because I'm actually kind of curious now. So define an agent. Can you give me a definition of an agent?
Yeah, just some sort of set of self-known beliefs and desires. So, I mean, I have a particular view of agency, but what's uncontroversial, my view might be a little controversial, but what is uncontroversial is just that an agent, if it's a thing, if you believe in a transcendental self or whatever, right? It doesn't really matter if you don't. I mean, you can paraphrase it any way you want, but it's minimally something that has beliefs and desires.
So does my first? I have so many questions now, but my first question is that so is it having the beliefs that makes agency, or does an agent have beliefs?
You wouldn't be an agent if you didn't have beliefs, right? The whole point is that what makes something an agent is that it has beliefs.
So does a infant that's not been born yet, is that an agent?
Well, you're just asking me whether or not I think infants have beliefs, But on this analysis, it might be the case. I don't know. Like, let's say infants don't have beliefs, then that just means that infants aren't agents. But if they do have beliefs, then they are,
So is it like a collection of beliefs that makes someone an agent?
Yeah, I think beliefs are necessary. And I think that there's this relation about beliefs where I think that they're constitutively self-known.
This just reminded me of something. I was debating Carneades.org one time, and he told me he doesn't have any beliefs. And I just immediately thought of that. So, I mean, you would obviously disagree. He obviously has beliefs. Like, I would disagree with him that he had beliefs.
Yeah, I think that what it means to think, to have a view, all of those things, to have desires, those are all to have beliefs.
So then my question is because I wouldn't agree that is what makes someone an agent. I would say an agent is a self-aware conscious being that has beliefs. So being an agent allows someone to have the ability to have beliefs, and then these beliefs are contingent upon the agent. They're processed by the agent, they're stored by the agent, they're used by the agent. I don't think that having beliefs makes someone an agent. These seem to be contingent upon their being agency to begin with.
Well, I mean, even if you took what you said, like self-awareness, right? I think that self-awareness is a belief. You have a concept of yourself, and a concept is the content of a belief, a propositional attitude.
Don't you first have to be self-aware you first have to be self-aware in order to then be aware of your beliefs? Because if you're not self-aware, you're not able to have beliefs then.
I'm just saying, I don't know what self-awareness is if it's not a belief. If it's not a concept of oneself, and I take a concept to be something like a propositional.
Let's start with consciousness then. Okay, so someone has to be conscious to have beliefs. Would you agree with me that beliefs are contingent on there being consciousness?
No, not in my view.
So then what is consciousness?
I mean, I think that's just qualitative states. Like, I don't think I could just...
Aren't qualitative states experienced in consciousness, though? Like, you're conscious of these qualitative states.
I just take that to be what consciousness is. It's composed...
Consciousness is...
Yeah, it's composed of qualitative states. It's not... There's no thing that exists that's having experiences. There's just experiences. I don't...
Well, I mean, as William Hasker says, who or what is conscious of these states?
I mean, I think that you might give some sort of relational account of why you would predicate some set of experiences as like some sort of unified block or whatever. I mean, it's ultimately material. I
mean, now you're getting into the hard problem, but you got to really actually show that consciousness is actually reduced to individual states instead of qualitative states being contingent and experienced in consciousness. Because my view is that you can't reduce consciousness to anything. Consciousness is constantly, or qualitative states, things, functions, processes are constantly experienced in consciousness. You can't divide up your current consciousness into the qualitative states. They're contingent and used within your consciousness.
Well, I think that this is sort of like a sidetrack, right? Like, because whether or not what your analysis is correct, I still think that even if everything that you said was true, it couldn't be the case that God has beliefs or desires, which whether or not what you said was true about agency or whatever, I just think that because beliefs and desires are normative states of affairs, they're oughts, they're aimed, they're teleological, that built into the notion of teleology itself is a concept of failure. Right, and so that means that's what it. There's something that it looks like. There's some possible states of affairs that it looks like for that thing to fail, that aimed thing not to be accomplishing its goal. Right. So
then let me try with an analogy. I mean, I believe 2 + 2 = 4. Is it possible for that to fail then?
It's possible for you not to believe that. Yeah.
It's possible for me not to believe it, but is it possible for that belief to fail? That 2 + 2 = 4.
Right. What I'm saying, the teleology of beliefs is that they're truth tracking, right? So if a belief is not tracking truth, then it's failing.
Okay, but it's still possible to believe all true things, though. I don't know if you and I define beliefs the same way, though. I mean, I don't think failure has to be necessarily built into beliefs.
Well, what do you not think that beliefs and desires are teleological?
I don't think all of them have to be, no.
Well, what do you think it would mean for a belief or a desire not to be teleological?
Well, tell me what you mean by that, because I'm still kind of confused, because I'm thinking of the example I gave you. I can believe 2 + 2 = 4. I don't see how that has to necessarily have failure built into that. So maybe we're not on the same page here.
Right. So if you failed to believe 2 + 2 = 4, that belief is a failure, because what I take a belief to be is a truth-aimed state, right? It's constitutive of a belief that it's aimed towards something being true, right? It couldn't. Okay. It's aimed towards.
But see, I agree with someone like Thomas Nagel that I would agree with him that it's impossible to believe 2 + 2 = 5. He talks about that in his book, The Last Word.
Right. I mean, I guess I'm not saying something like you couldn't have trivially true beliefs or whatever, right? I'm not saying anything like that. I guess I wouldn't accept what Nagel says, because I don't understand how Nagel could have some sort of demarcation between 2 + 2 and the number 5 and something like being ignorant of other arithmetical facts, right? Like that doesn't make sense with me. Like you can believe that the
how about I just quote him and then you can go from there. So I have a long quote I've written out for times like this. On page 63, he says this. He says, in skepticism about logic, we can never reach a point at which we have two possibilities with which all the evidence is compatible and between which it is therefore impossible to choose. The forms of thought that must be used in any attempt to set up such an alternative force themselves to the top of the heap. I cannot think, for example, that I would be in an epistemically identical situation if 2 + 2 = 5, but my brains are being scrambled, because I cannot conceive of 2 + 2 being equal to 5. The epistemic skeptic relies on reason to get us to a neutral point above the level of thought that are the object of skepticism. The logical skeptic can offer no such external platform, end quote. So what he's basically saying is it's just impossible to ever be in an epistemic situation where you could believe 2 + 2 = 5. It's not in the cards.
But you can believe something that's inconsistent with the true belief, right?
Yeah, but I mean, he's talking about in terms of logic itself. So I mean, what I'm trying to do is separate these ideas from beliefs that they have to, from this idea of failure. You can have beliefs that don't have to fail, or they have to have failure built into the possibility of them.
Well, I'm saying if you believe something that's inconsistent with that belief, then it's the case that it is a failure, right? Because the types of, like, if you just take a teleological notion, right? Notions of consistency or inconsistency, those are types of teleological notions, right? Like there's something that it looks like for the world to be one way rather than the way it ought to be, right? And I think things like beliefs and epistemic norms are oughts. They're like mental oughts, right?
I would distinguish. I don't think beliefs are oughts.
So I mean, like, you think that, like, what do you think about like, what do you think about like epistemic norms or something like that? Do you not think that those are, you do not think that you're committed to anything when you have a belief, or like you're not committed to, they're not reasons to believe things?
Well, I think there's of course reasons to believe things.
Yeah, but those reasons are commitments.
Your commitment is to the belief.
So, what? Sorry, yeah. Say that again.
Well, the reasons are what you use to commit to the beliefs, correct?
Right. So you can fail to be in accord with those commitments.
But I would distinguish and say that there are certain beliefs I can have that I can I cannot fail at, like 2 + 2 = 4. It's impossible to fail at that belief. So this goes back to the whole subject that God can have beliefs and failure doesn't have to be built into them.
But look, if the whole notion of a belief is that it commits you to some certain states of affairs, or commits you to some other beliefs or whatever, and you don't have those beliefs, then you've failed with respect to those commitments.
So, to get what you're saying, could you clarify a little bit, because this is getting very, very complicated. So please clarify a little bit.
Oh, sorry, that was just an open-ended question. I thought you were going to ask a follow-up question, like something specific you wanted me to clarify.
So, I mean, getting back to my main point, I don't see how failure is built necessarily into beliefs, because if someone is omniscient, someone would have all the information, and so all their beliefs could just logically not fail. I don't see why failure has to be a necessary part of belief.
Sorry, because the point is that what I take a belief to be is a type of commitment, right? You're committed to certain facts being true.
Okay, so you're committed to certain facts being true, but are there certain beliefs you could have that it's impossible to deny?
Yes.
So, okay, then if they're impossible to deny, there's no way that you could ever fail to have those beliefs, and they're in accord with the truth.
You can fail to have those beliefs, but you can believe things that are inconsistent with those beliefs. And if you believe things that are inconsistent with those beliefs, then you fail to live up to your commitments.
Okay.
Right, and so that's what I take a belief to be. is the commitment to those other things that you take. Maybe you take them to be entailments of some beliefs or whatever, right?
Are you equating commitments and beliefs?
Yeah, I'm saying what a belief is a type of commitment.
Okay, so I don't agree based on the example I gave you, because you could have a belief that's impossible. So you cannot fail to be committed to them.
Well, look, this is you can't fail to be. That's just to say a commitment is a commitment, right? Like, but let me just see if I can explain another way. Like when someone says that I believe this and I believe that. I believe whatever, right? It's perfectly natural in parlance to say, well, that commits you to this, that, and the other, right?
Okay, yeah. So let's get back to how this relates to God, because I feel like we're getting way down like a rabbit hole, and we're going to get lost if we don't turn around soon.
Yeah, okay. So the way it relates to God is I take failure to be constitutive of the concept of normativity, and things like beliefs and desires are normative. And if God is does not fail with respect to his beliefs or desires, then it's the case that God's beliefs and desires are not normative. But if they're not normative, then they're just not beliefs and desires. And so God just couldn't have beliefs and desires.
See, I would have to disagree with you that failure has to somehow be involved, and I can give an analogy, I guess. So let's say you're in a room and there's 5 doors, and you got to pick one door, or else the room is going to explode. Now, every one door will take you to a new room. I mean, sure, you could die, I guess you could say, but I mean, like, you're going to probably pick one of those doors, and let's say this happens like 10 or 12 other times. I guess what I'm trying to get at is, like, this goes back to what I was talking about at the beginning of this conversation, is that God has set in front of him these equally possible good worlds, and he picks one of them. I don't see how he has to fail when he's got free will in that situation itself to pick one of those possible worlds. Because, yeah, I agree, God cannot fail because he's not like a contingent agent like us, where he has to make moral decisions. But he can still pick from those possible worlds, and having free will is a property of agency. Being conscious and self-aware is a property of agency. And I don't see beliefs as necessarily being the basis of agency. So I think a lot of that it doesn't really add up at the end of the day.
Well, he might not fail. God might not fail to have acted, right? But if he acted with an aim, or if he had beliefs with respect to an aim, what it means to have a belief or to have those desires that constitute those aims is that there's a logically possible scenario that you can fail to be in accord with them. So an idea with that is, like, if you said 2 + 2 = 4, and that might commit you to all sorts of other arithmetical facts, right? Like facts about multiplication. But if that belief commits you to other facts about multiplication, and say you're wrong, like say you think you have a lapse in judgment and you think that 6 times 9 is equal to 64 rather than 54 or something like that. Now, if you take your beliefs about arithmetic to be constitutive of your beliefs about multiplication, then you failed with respect to your arithmetical beliefs, right? Because you're committed, because you believe 2 + 2 = 4, you're committed to believing things like that 6 times 9 = 54. And if you don't believe that, then you're out of accord with that commitment that you have.
Right? You're out of accord with that commitment due to lack of information or knowledge. It has nothing to do with free will in that sense.
No, but I'm just saying it's a feature of what it means to be a belief that it's got.
But
that.
It wouldn't be a feature if you were omniscient.
Well, yeah, but I mean that's just to beg the question against the argument that I'm rendering, right? Because
the argument is against God's existence in and of itself, and so it's trying to argue that God cannot be omnipotent because he cannot fail. And I mean, in my video, I define omnipotence as all powerful. Just it's like the whole thing. My initial thought was, well, this just doesn't really make sense because omnipotence is the inability to fail, and so. Right. I mean, I think you're setting up like a false dichotomy, is in that God either has to be an agent and be able to fail, or if he cannot fail, he's not an agent.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. Yeah, and I would simply take the third option that God is also omniscient, and so that when it take your arithmetic example, it's that he cannot fail because he has perfect knowledge in these types of things. But again, it goes back to how I define agency. I don't see agency as this collection of beliefs. And I don't see beliefs as necessarily having to have the failure within them. I mean, you keep talking about how some beliefs are contingent upon like 2 + 2 = 4, and those could fail. But that misses my whole point. You can have a belief about 2 + 2 = 4, and it's impossible on that specific belief, not other connected beliefs, but on that specific belief for it to ever fail, as Nagel argues.
All right, we'll have to wrap it up. That went on.
Yeah, I don't know if we were on the same page. I'm sorry, Josh, but I do have to get going.
Yeah. So thank you so much for doing that. It kind of lingered on, and I hope you're not feeling tired or anything, Michael.
I'm always exhausted. I have a toddler.
Oh, thank you so much, Michael, for doing this. We really want to thank you. The audience enjoyed this greatly. It was so awesome to have you on, and